thousands of women around the world spoke out against sexual harassment using just 2 words: Me Too.
The Me Too movement, it is growing this morning. Remember, Alyssa Milano started it all, inspiring millions of women to share their personal stories of sexual harassment.
It's the Me Too movement, but things have changed.
We begin with breaking news of verdicts in the civil rape and defamation trial of former President Donald Trump.
But what I never was a rapist. I've never engaged in non-consensual activity.
Mr. McGregor, you're a rapist.
We're living in a time where some of the most powerful men are men who are either accused or found responsible for assault.
In 2017, the hashtag #MeToo spread across the world, exposing stories of sexual harassment and abuse that had long remained hidden and in silence. While its origins were rooted in Western feminist activism, the movement soon reached countries like the Philippines. Today, we ask the question, what is the Me Too movement and what is it for the Filipino women? When we talk about the Me Too movement, most of us would immediately think that the hashtag in Twitter started it all, when in fact the movement can be seen way before the hashtag was even involved. The movement can be traced as far back as 2006 with Tarana Burke. She was a social activist who worked with survivors of sexual violence. Particularly, we can see her works with the women of color. Her goal was healing, solidarity, and support through telling the stories of those who have survived as victims of sexual assault. Then, over the years, the movement exploded globally. Particularly in 2017, after allegations against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein revealed decades of abuse protected by power and by silence. The hashtag was started by actress Alyssa Milano, who encouraged survivors to share their own stories using the hashtag, and millions responded through their own retweets and reposts of their own stories. This brought change not only in Hollywood's culture of silence, fearing for their career, but also trickled throughout different households, workplaces, countries, and communities where people share their own stories to address the problems in their environment. The drive for the Me Too movement advanced greatly due to social media being accessible across the world. That is why this movement is a great example that feminism and women movement are not only limited to the geographical spaces. Though there are differences between when the movement and the social media phenomenon started, there is no clear difference given that both came from the power of shared narratives. Because of these movements, because of this phenomenon, survivors realize that they are not alone. Thus, the hashtag and the movement transformed private pain into collective resistance against what is the norm. And it showed that there is a problem that needs to be addressed and that needs to be fixed. So to have a better context on how the movement impacted Filipino feminism, let us look into the experiences of these Filipino women throughout history. During the pre-colonial period, Filipino women held positions of power and respect. Notably, in the pre-colonial Philippines, there were women in the positions as leaders, healers, and priestesses. We can see this through having babaylans mostly being women. The role was not limited to healing, but rather known to have been like partners to datos when it comes to developing the community. So, we can see that Filipino women during these times possessed a large measure of freedom to assimilate with men in different social, religious, political, and economic functions without being regarded as inferior or subordinate to men. Spanish colonization dismantled this balance through the introduction of European androcentric practices. Women were reshaped into ideals of obedience, of purity, and silence. A great example of this ideal woman can be seen reflected in characters like Maria Clara, Julie, Sisa, in Rizal's novel called No Limitang Gere. Those that did not fit into the mold of the ideal women were deemed as weak, as sinful, and subject for subjugation. That is why when the babaylans were against these kinds of practices, they were stigmatized as demonic and as people who do witchcrafts. Abuse became actually a norm, or it was normalized through religion patriarchy, and the social hierarchy. These colonial ideas persisted into modern Filipino society, where discussions about sex, harassment, and abuse remain a taboo or sensitive topic that people tend to gloss over or not talk about seriously. Speaking out is often seen as not courage, but as shame. However, that does not mean that women's activism among Filipino women was not present throughout the years. Women's activism in the Philippines could be classified in two major phases. First, the women's demands for suffrage in the 1920s and 30s, focusing on their rights to vote, and the post-1980s struggles that continues to the present. The height of feminist consciousness in the Philippines was at its peak in the early 70s and 80s. Marcos politics motivated the formation of left-leaning movements such as the Party Kalayaan, Pilipina, Gabriela, and Makibaka. The end of the Marcos era signaled new channels for these women's movements. At present, you can see that women's activism in the Philippines leans more towards the legislative and consciousness-raising strategies.
Pinay feminism is not Western feminism applied to Filipino women. It is a localized version of the feminist framework that grows out of the Filipino history, colonial experiences, family structures, and community values. It is the philosophy that was adapted to our local context. It's not just applying the Western ideas of feminism, but also looks into the local contexts on what are the women's roles in the country. Different cultures, they follow different norms, different roles assigned to each gender. And what this does is that it implies or it relies on storytelling, collective action, shared experiences, and rational responsibility. These concepts like pakikisama and pakikiisa, getting along with others and standing together as a community, shape how Filipino women express their resistance and solidarity. However, the Me Too movement or the Me Too concept comes from a cultural setting where public exposures and direct accusations are more socially accepted. In the Philippines, this is not the case. In most of the cases, for women, especially in this case, they tend to they don't want to make it public. They want to keep it private. They want to keep their voice hidden. They want to keep their stories hidden. They don't want it to be announced outside. Because of this, it cannot be directly copied, it cannot be directly translated into the Filipino context, but it should be adapted. It should be translated and localized. In this way, it does not replace the Filipina or Pinay feminism. Instead, it is a tool on that when reshaped by Filipino values, it can help Filipina women reclaim voice, visibility, and agency on their own terms.
We want to uplift those voices that may be marginalized and say that this doesn't only impact people in Hollywood, this doesn't only impact people in academia, it impacts everyday women, and oftentimes perpetrators are people who we know, right? Not just these big wig, public people in positions of power.
Rise up for the women of the world!
Despite the cultural differences and the cultural barriers, it did not stop the Me Too movement to penetrate into the Filipino society. There are examples, there are cases of high-profile celebrities, athletes, beauty pageants who have shared their voices through social media. One such case includes the journalist of Gretchen Pulido. These stories were amplified through their posts on social media, wherein their followers engage and share their experiences of misogyny in politics, and it encouraged women to speak out collectively. The movement also helped push conversations that supported laws like the Safe Spaces Act, which expanded protections against harassment in public spaces.
So far, we know this conversation has been happening for a lot longer than 5 years, but when you look at the momentum of the Me Too movement, what has come of that?
Well, I think that people have realized that it's not a moment, it's a movement.
It opened conversations once considered impossible. It challenged silence. It encouraged Filipino women to recognize shared experiences from abuse and resistance. By localizing global movements like the Me Too movement, Filipino women can continue to shape Pinay feminism, not a borrowed ideology, but as a living, evolving response of their own histories and realities. Because gender violence is not just a woman's issue, it is a cultural issue, a historical issue, and a human issue.